So we're going to talk about some cultural patterns. The first thing we're going to talk about is the concept of sense of place. So I want you to envision your hometown or your childhood home or maybe a place you went on vacation. Just visualize a place. Now, what are you thinking of? Maybe you're thinking of the sounds that you heard, the places that you saw, maybe the people that you were with. Maybe there was a very smell that you remember, very familiar smell or a very specific smell to that place. Maybe you heard something. Maybe it was a construction sound, like a beep, or maybe you heard buses going by or cars. Maybe you heard birds chirping. Maybe you heard the waves crashing if you're thinking of a beach. You have a perception of that place. You have a unique perception of place, a unique sense of place, and you will perceive that place differently than maybe another person will. And how you perceive a place and the elements of it in the cultural landscape, that's what creates a sense of place. Think of a place you haven't been for before. What do you imagine that place is like? So, for example, I've never been to France, so I can kind of imagine what France would be like. I'm thinking of Paris, particularly. I'm hearing that accordion that people hear for French music. For some reason, I smell bread. I think of the Eiffel Tower and French architecture and balconies and uniform windows. I'm thinking of a lot of just what I would think a French landscape would look like. I envision hearing that French accent. I don't know any French, so I'm just kind of thinking of probably French gibberish, for instance. But think of a place that you haven't been for before. How do you imagine that place is like? You actually have a sense of place of places you've never been to based on your prior experiences and expectations. So you can imagine coastal Florida. I live in Florida, so I know what coastal Florida is like. The coast of Florida is different on the west and the east. The west has more sandy beaches. Not as good as the west, but it's still cool. Nice palm trees, You can imagine coastal Maine. It's probably going to vary depending on where you're from. If you think of coastal Maine, like from Florida, when I think of Maine, I think of snow. So I may think of snow on the beach or snowy mountains. People that may not be from Florida or people from Florida, you may envision coastal Maine as with those lighthouses and those nice big houses with the red roofs or the rocky jetties in the water. You can think of the waves crashing against the rocks here. You may think of those lush trees and dense forests that we find a lot in Maine. A sense of place, a definition of sense of place would be the feeling or perception that people have about a location, and it's created by a combination of physical and human characteristics. So it's a combination of the actual physical landscape as well as what humans do to the landscape and the human environment, as well as your past experiences. It's that feeling you have about a place, and maybe it's a feeling that you love a place so much, like you love your hometown. That's a sense of nostalgia. Maybe you don't like a certain place. Like for one, I do not like Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or New Orleans. So I'm not going to have a very positive perception of it compared to maybe other places in the world or other places even in Louisiana. So here's a good example. Maybe you've traveled across the world and you've had French fries across the world. That might make it a little bit easier here, but French fries vary across the world. So when you think of Canada and you're thinking of maybe French fries in Canada, you might think of French fries in America, but it's actually different. Or you may think of the actual French fries that they have in Canada and maybe compare or contrast them to those in the United States. You might think, oh, these French fries are terrible. I don't like how they make them there. I prefer the French fries from the United States. So it kind of varies depending on where you are, and these are just different elements of cultures. And if you visualize maybe the different ways that they make certain foods, like for example, you could think of pizza in Chicago. I think of Chicago deep dish pizza. I'm starting to think about different elements of Chicago, but I'm also starting to think about, wow, I don't like deep dish pizza that much. The cheese is nice, but I prefer maybe New York style over Chicago deep dish pizza. When I think of New York style pizza, I think of those little booths on the side of the road with pizza, maybe hot dogs or pretzels. I think of those $1 pizza places that aren't really a dollar anymore, but that's what I'm thinking of, and it caused me to think about a lot of things. We're still talking about sense of place here. I'm still talking about the perceptions I have of certain places. Now let's talk about the concept of placemaking. So placemaking involves the planning, design, and management and use of spaces that reflect cultural identity of a community. So it's influenced by the cultural and historical context. So here we see a statue of, I think that's Paul Revere. So that shows, I think this is Boston. So that is Paul Revere. So we see a significance of the history of Paul Revere because his home was in Boston. So we see that, this historical context. And if you come to the South, you'll find a lot of Civil War statues and historical places and museums. We look at economic factors as well. Maybe a place is very developed, so they have the money to afford to plant all these nice flowers in the park. Maybe they'll build high-rise buildings with modern materials or expensive facilities, or they have very expensive transportation. maybe areas that don't have as much money will have more run-down buildings or brownfields. Look at community involvement. Are there a lot of places for the community to come together? Are there recreational facilities or social squares or plazas? We see those a lot in Europe and South America here. What about policies? What political policies are being passed within the city that influence how the city runs and how society runs? What about the demographics? Some cities may have a lot of young people, particularly if it's urbanizing and bringing in a lot of jobs, because the labor market is particularly younger over older. Maybe we're looking at a more retirement area, a retirement district, or like a town in Florida that people go to retire, like the Villages or Ponte Vedra. That's another beach. DeSantis has a home there. That's why I'm thinking of it. Maybe the physical environment. Are they making use of the trees here? I remember traveling to Atlanta in Georgia about a year ago, and I remember going down the interstates, and I remember seeing a bunch of the trees when going over an overpass. They kind of use the environment a little bit to make the interstates. So if I go to Florida, not so much. There's not a lot of environmental aspects to the interstates and the roads. If we look at this bottom picture here, we see a lot of that use and preservation of land here, and we actually see greenery on the roofs of these buildings. We can see a courtyard in the middle of all the buildings here that show a use of green space and promotion of the environment. So what makes a great place? That's actually going to vary depending on the person. It's a perceptual. But what goes into placemaking? We can look at street life. Is it welcoming so people can walk on the street without worrying having to be hit by a car? We don't typically see that in the suburbs, but we see that more in urban areas. I was in Italy last summer, and I can tell you that there were a lot of places where walking seemed very invitational, and then there were areas where I felt like I was just going to get hit by a car at any minute. We can look at more access and linkages. Is there transit uses? Is there public transportation? Does the public transportation work? Is it crowded? We can look at comfort and image. Is there a lot of crime or not a lot of crime? Is there good sanitation? Are the buildings very well maintained? Are they old, or maybe that they run down? And we look at uses and activities. Is there good rent? Is there good retail available? Is it cheap or affordable? What about the land use? Are they building up or are they building out? What about who owns the local businesses and the owners of the facilities in the industry within the place we're talking about? We're not talking about just cities, but we're talking about any place in general. These are all the components that create a great place. What about social networks? Can you interact with people? Are there events for you? Maybe like there's dances or volunteer facilities for you, places where you can be maybe politically engaged as well. So all these go into what creates a, and there will be different priorities depending on the person on what goes into making place. And those interesting characteristics that you have that have higher priorities, you're going to notice them more when talking about a place. So if I look at a city, one of the first things I look at is how walkable it is. Another thing that I look at is how much crime there is, or the building architecture. That's something that I look at with any place particularly, is the architecture. I look for religious architecture. I look for historical architecture as well as modern architecture. What are they using within this city? And we can see here, we see that they took out parking spots here in this town and made it a bench place. They put some trees up to kind of show environmental preservation, as well as kind of a more social place. You can go there and eat your lunch if you'd like. We can see that, yeah, there's cars can travel down the road, but this is a more safe place. They have a fence up to protect the people from the cars here. So that's pretty cool, a good part of the placemaking. I would say this is a very positive addition to this town. And if I see this, let's say if I'm looking at going through the street view of this town on Google Maps, I might see this and I'm going to attribute that positively, that's how you say it, to my sense of place of this town. Now, there are regional patterns of language that we see. Of course, if you go to France, most of the buildings are going to be in French. If you go to China, most of them are in Mandarin. I think this is from a Chinatown in the United States. We see a mix of English, like we see here, the sweet house or betting shop. And we also see a mix of Chinese, or just it's an Asian language. I'm pretty sure it's Chinese. And then on the right here, we have French. We have a French language here on this building. So we could be in France, or maybe a French populated area like Quebec, Canada. So here we have a map. This shows, what do you call lobster? Do you call it crawfish, crayfish, crawdad? Some people they don't say anything. So I'm from the South. We say crawfish, but if you go to New England, a lot of people say crayfish. If you go to the Midwest, some people say crawdad, or some people say crayfish, depending on where you're at. So these different ways of saying a certain word, that creates a sense of place, area. And actually, people will judge it, and that's going to create your placemaking. Actually judge it positively or negatively. in a place. So if I see, like, I'm from Florida, so if I go to Louisiana and people say crawfish, I'm going to associate that with, with crawfish. I'm actually going to I might understand what they're talking about. If I go to Oklahoma and say crawdad, I may not instantly understand what they're talking about. I might need a little nudge, a little push to understand what they're talking about here. But there's a lot of factors that go into this placemaking here. We can see these patterns of language. It doesn't have to be just what the language is being spoken here, but we can also just look at the different dialects here, the different phonics, the different words that they use depending on the region that you're in. Now, something we look at is, of course, dialects. We look at accents. That's kind of what we're looking at here is the accents. But we're here looking at just different languages present. So Mandarin is the most spoken language in China, but there's a lot of other languages being spoken in China. We look at Tibetan and Mongolian. We actually look at Korean as you get close to the Korean peninsula. We look at different languages different by different groups of Chinese individuals in southern China, around the eastern coast as well. We go further out west, we can see as we get closer to other countries like Russia that different languages change as well depending on where you are. So we see a lot of variation within the languages, and that's going to impact the culture of different areas of China. And we can also look at regional patterns of religion, not just language here. So we can see here, this is the Mormon church within the United States. And when I think of Utah, one of the first things I think of are the Mormons, because that's a very, very prominent religion within Utah and the surrounding states. As we can see here, it's not as prominent in Florida and other states across the country. But if you look at Utah, it's dark red. It's bleeding. Utah is bleeding of Mormonism because it's very, very popular. Most of the counties in Utah have 66% or higher percent of the members of the county are part of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, which is the Mormon church here. So that contributes to the sense of place and the placemaking. We're going to see a lot more Mormon church compared to other religions within this area. Maybe the values of the people, the values of the culture in Utah are going to be those that are reflected by the church and the Mormon church. We can look at Jewish culture here. So we see the distribution of Jewish people. Most Jews live in North America. Then we see a lot in the Middle East. This is actually of 2010, so it's not exactly as accurate as it would be today, 14 years later, but it's still relatively close. The Middle East, where Israel is, and North America, that's where the most of the Jewish people live. There's still some left in Europe, but for the most part, they left Europe after World War II for obvious reasons. Some live in South America. We see very few, only about 100,000, maybe a little less, living in Sub-Saharan Africa, and maybe about double that in the Asian continents here, in the Pacific area and Oceania region. So we can see here that if we want to find a synagogue or other types of Jewish architecture or Jewish culture, just Jewish people, we want to see people speaking Hebrew, we're either going to look towards North America or we're going to look towards Israel or other surrounding areas of the Middle East, particularly Israel, though. There's a lot less religious tolerance in a lot of the states and countries in the Middle East as well. We can look at regional patterns of ethnicity and what different ethnic groups are present. So this is a picture of, I think it's Nigeria. Yeah. So we can see that there's over hundreds of ethnic groups in Nigeria, for one. There's hundreds of them. They all have their own unique culture groups, their values and priorities and practices and taboos, which are just elements of culture we talked about in 3.1. So we can see here that there's a lot of different patterns of ethnicity. So if you go to a different part of Nigeria, there's going to be different cultures because there's going to be different ethnicities there. We go to different parts of, like, say, New York. You can go to Chinatown. There's the areas with maybe more African American population, more Caucasian population, more Asian population, more Indian population. We're going to see different patterns in different people, of course, different languages, different religions, that sort of thing that impacts the place and how the place is developed. In places maybe a lot more Christians, we're going to see a lot more churches. Places a lot more Jewish people, we see a lot more synagogues. Places a lot more Muslims, we see a lot more mosques and architecture that goes by the Islamic faith. We see a lot more Islamic values in areas with more Muslims. And a lot of different ethnic groups are associated with more religions and, of course, more languages, different traditions and culture values. Different cultures have different foods, so we might see different types of restaurants spring up in different areas. This is of different ethnic groups and races. This is from the 2020 census in the United States. So we can see that most counties are primarily Caucasian. We see some counties, particularly in the southeast, that are African American. We see some that are Indian or Alaskan Native. Alaska, there's a lot of Alaskan Native. We don't see many Asians. We see, I think, 2 in California that are Asian. And then closer to the border of Mexico, we see a lot more Hispanic. We actually see some in Florida as well. It's pretty interesting, pretty cool. So yeah, we can see here that maybe if you go to a place like in Texas, you see a lot more Hispanic architecture, Spanish language, Hispanic food, that sort of thing. If you go to a place like New England, Not so much. Now, there are two more concepts we have to talk about. We talk about centripetal forces and centrifugal forces. So, centripetal forces bring people together. They unify. This could be a common religion. Like in the Middle East, for the most part, Islam is the prominent religion. If you go to Israel, that's going to be Judaism, Jewish people. And we have a common language. For the most part, that's Mandarin in China. But we saw the pattern in China was there was a lot of different religions, but the main religion was Mandarin. If you go to the United States, the main not like religion, the main language is English. If you go to Canada, the main language is English, but there's aspects of French in Canada. This could be a common history. So in Germany, there's unification from the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was a major historical event, led to the people in Germany unifying and celebrating, and people did that across the world as well. So the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, it symbolized the end of the Cold War divisions, and it fostered a sense of renewed unity as well as national identity in Germany. We look at nationalism, where people have pride in their nation or the country that they're in. We look at this with the 4th of July in the United States. We could look at government legitimacy. Are people believing that their government is doing something good and benefiting society? So public services in Singapore, people believe that Singapore, the government is doing a good job with the public services. So that's going to unify them. The effectiveness and efficiency of public services in Singapore will contribute to high levels of trust in the government. That's what legitimacy is. And we can look at examples like Sing Health or the schools or the mass transit system or the water management system here. We can look at tragedy as well as a centripetal force. For example, 9/11 actually brings people together as sort of a mourn, and people will reflect upon 9/11, that awful attack that it had on the United States, as well as the effects that it had in travel, as well as American culture and their views of foreign nations. We can look at winning a war or a sports game as a centripetal force. For example, Usain Bolt's victory in 2016 brought Jamaica together, as he was a symbol of athletics and competition in Jamaica. It's made them stand out, and it made them come together and celebrate his victory within the Olympics here. So let's look at an FRQ from 2006. We're going to describe a centripetal force in one of the countries shown. And they didn't label the countries, but you should probably know that India is one of them. So that would probably be one of the easiest to do. But you could have done some of the other countries like Bangladesh or Nepal or Sri Lanka. So let's look at religion, for example. We see a lot of Hinduism in India, Nepal. We see Islam in Pakistan, as well as Bangladesh, and Buddhism in Bhutan. We can look at language as well. So we see Urdu, which is an official language. We can look at Punjabi or English in Pakistan. We can look at Hindi or English in India, Bengali and Bangladesh. These are languages that majority of the population speaks, so it's going to bring them together for communication purposes. We can look at expressions of national pride or symbols like sports teams or flags or a national anthem. For example, there's a big prominence of cricket in India. We can see different place name changes in India. We look at transportation and communication infrastructure, such as railroads in India that bring people together. It can be something as simple as that. Maybe there's a bus system or highway systems that brings people together because they can travel from place to place. If we have communication technologies like cell phone towers, that allows people to talk to each other. Those are centripetal forces, or physical features that are centripetal forces. We look at shared history, like a history of British imperialism. People may say that's a negative history, but it is still shared history. We can see the creation of states like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh as a result and after British imperialism. We can look at common external threats that can be found in India and Pakistan from surrounding powers and surrounding countries. We can look at Sri Lanka and Bhutan being compact states. We can look at charismatic or a strong leader. So we see an absolute monarchy in Nepal, and people will unify under this monarchy and submit to its sovereignty. We can see a military leader in Pakistan that can be compared. We see forward capital. So we could see the capital of Pakistan being moved, and that brought people together because they supported this decision. We look at disaster response to different environmental disasters like the earthquakes in Pakistan, or cyclone or flooding in Bangladesh, tsunamis in India and Sri Lanka. And you actually have to, and on this FRQ, you have to reference the unifying effect on the population. They came together to respond to the disaster here and relieve those that were in need or in trouble. We look at economic development programs. Economic development, of course, brings people together because it leads to more sufficiency. And we see different programs like self-sufficiency programs in India. Physical geography. For example, we have a river valley, and then Pakistan is isolated by mountains and deserts. So it keeps outside people out and unifies and creates a more tight-knit community within the country of Pakistan. And finally, you have government. For example, India has a representative democracy, so people can come together to vote on representatives that will make decisions on their behalf. Now, the opposite of centripetal forces are centrifugal forces with an F. And if you need to remember these, you actually do need to remember these, but how to remember these? Think of the F in centrifugal. What word starts with an FU? The bad word. So you can think of centrifugal as dividing people. You can say that's more of a bad thing, to bring people apart. Now, what causes to divide people? What are these centrifugal forces? We look at differences. We see differences, we see diversity, we see centrifugal forces. So differences in history, culture, language, religions, ethnicity, race, so on. Those divide people because they're different. And these two entities used to be together. They used to be part of the United Kingdom, but religious differences and other tensions and conflict divided the people, and it ultimately led to Ireland separating from Northern Ireland and becoming its own country. We look at Belgium. It's actually divided between the Dutch-speaking Flanders in the north and the French-speaking Wallonia in the south. We look at economic disparities, economic inequalities that, of course, will divide people. There's significant economic inequality in Brazil between the urban areas like Sao Paulo and Rio, as well as the impoverished rural regions. So the urban areas may have more development, a lot more economic development with jobs, but the rural areas do not. So there's going to be significant economic inequality. We can look at political fragmentation, instability, as well as differences in policies. That's going to vary how different areas of a country are run. So following the fall of Gaddafi, Libya has experienced political fragmentation with competing governments and militia, and that's led to, of course, different leaders and different ways that the country is run. It's like a new age, every single leader, and that's led to instability as well as just ongoing conflict. They want a stable political system, but they just don't have it. We see immigration as well as integration challenges, because immigration brings in people from different cultures that have differences between the indigenous people or just the people living there right now, and that can lead to challenges in integration and integrating within the culture and society. We'll see challenges with social and cultural cohesion. So, for example, we see a lot of Syrian refugees going into Germany and other countries in Europe, and that's led to social and cultural tensions, as well as debates about multiculturalism and national identity and preserving the national identity in Germany and these other countries. We look at political disagreements, such as partisan politics in the United States. We see the Democratic and the Republican Party that divide people very extremely in the United States today. It's a lot more polarized than it used to be. We look at geographic features such as the Himalayas that divide different countries in southern Asia, as well as Japan, which is an island. It's isolated from the rest of Asia and other parts of the world. They have a lot more control on who comes in and out of the country, and people may not travel there as much because it is an island. So let's look at that FRQ again. The next part was to describe a centrifugal force, a force that divides people within one of the countries shown. We can look at religion, for instance. So there's a president of Islam and Hinduism in India and Bangladesh. There's Buddhism and Hinduism in Sri Lanka. We see different types of Muslims in Pakistan. In Kashmir, we see Islam and Hinduism. We see Sikhism and Hinduism in India, or Sikhism and Islam in India. And we see a lot of different religions in India. And these religions are different. They have different values and different practices, actually different architecture, for instance, as well. So we could see on a cultural landscape different types of architecture, different types of worship centers. And that's going to divide people. These are centrifugal forces. We look at languages. India has 14 to 18 official languages. They have 4 prominent language families, which are entirely different from one another and have entirely different grammar and syntax and words. And there's been disputes over place name changes in India, what language these places should be in. And the languages, of course, divide people because it's hard to communicate people who speak a different language, let alone a different language family than you, because there's pretty much no similarities in between the languages. We look at federal governments in India. So India has a federal government system, so each of the states have their own regional government, and that's going to lead to different policies depending on what states that you're in. We see that in the United States as well. Look at different ethnicities being present in these countries. And we look at separatist movements as maybe these ethnicities want their own sovereignty, or maybe want their own countries and want to separate from the countries that they're in. We can see rebellion, rebellious movements or protests. We look at different state shapes. So we see that Bangladesh is an exclave in India. So India surrounds Bangladesh, and that could lead to pressures within Bangladesh, but it also leads to divisions as well. We look at external threats as well that bring in divisive tactics as well as warfare within India and Pakistan. We look at territorial disputes like the territory of Kashmir. Pakistan claims it, India claims it, and that can divide the people, or just at least divide the two countries depending on who wants Kashmir, what they say about Kashmir and the territorial disputes. Look at a multi-core state. So we have several different large cities in India as well. We don't have one large central city. We see that in some countries like Bangladesh, but in larger countries like India, we typically see several different large cities. We see that in the United States, for instance. We see that in Italy, for instance. So that can divide people, as these different cities may have different aspects, or they may compete against one another. As well as we could just look at physical geography. So for example, mountains can divide the different communities in Nepal. It actually can divide the different countries as well and serve as physical borders. Look at another FRQ. This is from 2016. So, for example, we just had to think about the primary language spoken in the shaded area. Now, this is Canada. So you might say English, but we're actually not shading all of Canada. We're shading the eastern part of Canada. And we've talked about this before, but Quebec is part of eastern Canada, and a big part of the culture there is French culture. So the primary language spoken in this shaded area is actually French. Now, that means that a lot of people in this area are bilingual. So that's kind of sets up our next point here. And explain how bilingualism can have a positive impact on a country. So we're looking more at centripetal forces with a P here, which bring people together. So it creates a sense of place, which we talked about earlier. Bilingualism gives minority language speakers a feeling or belonging or value because most people are bilingual, and it produces a unique cultural landscape with architecture, farming, and signage. So, for example, the signage could be in different languages. The architecture could reflect the different cultures of the minority groups. And if people are bilingual, it provides the minority language speakers a sense of belonging because they're bilingual as well. They might speak the prominent language like French, or they may speak the more indigenous language, or they may just speak English. We look at education because bilingual students, as opposed to monolingual students, can have more improved knowledge, perspectives, and skill sets for skill sets such as speaking languages. We look at multiculturalism and cultural diversity. That can actually bring people together because it can bring in immigrants. It can empower minorities. It can bring in minority rights or promote minority rights. So just because we have diversity doesn't mean we have centrifugal forces. Yes, we do, but we also have some centripetal forces from diversity. We can see the expression of unique cultural products such as music, literature, film, and television. Look at economic advantages as well because you can develop global business opportunities and promote tourism and improve the local economy in this region, just improve the economy of the country. And that's going to bring people together. Now let's look at the negative impacts of bilingualism. Let's talk about those centrifugal forces, the F that divides people, FU, that sort of thing. So we can see tensions between the different groups of people or the people speaking different languages. We can see discrimination, segregation. We can see different barriers to different interaction, barriers to communication, as some people may not know the languages. We can see ethnocentrism. People will judge the cultures by their own cultural perspective. We can look at political forces, such as regionalized language areas within the country that may seek their own independence or become areas of conflict. We look at separatism, which may affect the economy or weaken the state. It can lead to devolution, where powers pass from higher governments to lower governments, and that creates regional variation in the policies and how the areas of the country are governed. We look at various challenges to unity, as there could be translation problems, lack of understanding of other people who speak different languages. We could look at different countrywide policies. We don't have uniform policy within the country, so that's going to differ on how the country is run depending on where you are. We could look at a lot of economic disadvantages. Yeah, it could bring in tourism or global businesses, but we could see increased costs to print or broadcast public information or produce documents, signages, or even provide public services, perform elections, enforce laws and public safety, because we have to cater to the people who speak the different languages. And this can impose on businesses, that can cost them more money, and then to advertise and provide public and services in more than one language, that's going to cost them more money because they want to appeal to as many people as they can, because the point of a business is as much money as possible, so you want to cater to as many consumers as possible. And if these consumers speak entirely different languages, you're going to have to cater to these entirely different languages, or you're only going to have a small portion of the population go to your business. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really does help me out, and it costs $0. I have some free resources for you in the description down below if you'd like to use them. If you have any AP Human Geography related questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below the video or send me a message on Discord. I'll see you guys in the next video though. Adios.